Okay, in this video, I'm going to show you guys how to approach tube grooming for XGen and Maya. Essentially how to build out the tubes that you're going to generate these stylized or very specific shapes for your hair to grow from. So the reason why we're using tube grooming is because we have these very particular shapes we're trying to hit with our hair. And if you're just using normal guides for XGen, you're going to get a lot of interpolation that is going to essentially not give you these specific shapes, but give you a lot of blended shapes in between. And so everything becomes one kind of homogeneous mess, and you can't control, the hair that's growing from here to follow all the way down to this shape, as opposed to just growing in front of the face or growing all the way down to this shape. We're going to be using geometry, and we're calling them tubes, to create these guides and to create the mapping of which hairs are supposed to follow which tube or which guide. And so this is the hair. I color coded it so you can see essentially the groupings of the hairs, right? And so some of them, it's a little less noticeable, like why, we really even need them as a separate tube, right? Because they're so close together and they kind of blend in together. And ignore the kind of transparency in some of these. I'm using a lower density so it goes faster. But this is a good example right here, right? You can see a clear division in shape we're trying to get. And if I hide or show the guides and hide the hair, you can see these, it's a little hard to look at, but you can see these are the guides that are generating or guiding the hair that's being grown into those specific shapes. And these guides are based on geometry that I'm feeding into the tube grooming system. So if I hide the guides and show the tubes that I'm using, you can see they have that same shape. And so those guides are following the shapes of those tubes, and then the guides are controlling the direction and growth of the hair. Okay, so I'm going to take you guys through several steps of this. First, I'm going to show you guys the basics of how to run tube grooming. Then I'm going to show you guys kind of the principles behind tube grooming with some visual examples in Photoshop, so you guys better understand kind of like what tube grooming is doing and why we're doing it. And then I'll show you guys how to control and create the tubes that you're going to be growing the hair from. Okay, for tube grooming to work, we need to be essentially following the same rules of creating guide-based or spline-based. Okay, for tube grooming to work, we need to be following the same basic principles we would be using for doing guide-driven descriptions inside of XGen. So we need, a properly prepared scalp with good geometry and UVs laid out. And we need to be working in a description that is going to be using splines and placing and shaping guides. And so that's what we need to get the tube grooming to work, because tube grooming is going to be inside that tool. What we also need is we need a particular type of geometry for growing the guides. So I have here, these are what are called tubes, or what we call tubes, that are essentially just going to be cylinders. And so there's a couple of basic rules for these cylinders that we're going to follow. And I'm going to show you guys how I kind of set this up and some of the kind of gotchas that you have with this sort of thing. So these have to be quad, right? You can't have any triangles, can't have any n-gons, right? You need to have it just like cylindrical topology with no caps, so that it, you have your grid of polygons going straight up from the base of the cylinder to the tip of the cylinder. And conveniently, we can also call this the root and the tips, like you would the root of the hair and tips of the hair. That's what I often call, right? So this is the root to the tip, and then we have a grid-like structure of polygons going up it. So we have these subdivisions, or these edge loops going up this way, and you have, of course, your edge loops going in the perpendicular direction from root to tip. So if your topology is laid out that way, then you're good to go. If it's anything else, or it's, has like a redirection of topology in a new direction, there's a really good chance, I'm pretty sure, actually 100% chance, that it's just not going to generate any guides for you. So it needs this kind of shape here. Okay. The rule for this is it has to be, one end has to be essentially intersecting or close to intersecting the scalp. There's a lot of leeway here, right? You don't have to have it actually touching the scalp. It can go through a little bit further, or it could just hover above it. But you really want to get it as close to the scalp as you can, because if it's not quite on the scalp, it's going to start guessing, right? The hair or the guides that you grow are going to jump to the scalp, right? It's going to snap down, and you might not be able, it might not do what you want it to do. It might not snap the way you want it to. So you can see here what I did was I just essentially to control that, you can just grab the tube and you can either set this to be a snap target, so selecting the scalp and setting it as a snap target, and then selecting these vertices and moving them so that they snap to the surface, right? Or another thing is if it's already kind of like in this shape and I don't want it to like kind of move, you can see when I snap it, it can like move left and right, right? But I only want it to move up and down along this edge. Another thing I can do is just use, switch the move tool and, move tool and do, I think it's Control Shift middle mouse click. Yeah, so let me turn that off, the snapping. So Control Shift middle mouse click is going to be the hotkey for sliding. So you can use this to slide these. Oh, come on. I did not want to do that. Okay, there we go. Slide the vertice essentially along its edges that are bounding it, right? So if I just want to move this so it just touches or gets close to touching the scalp, I can just move it up like that. Really only works with moving up from the inside up into the from the inside outwards. You couldn't go from outwards. Let's move it up here. I couldn't move it outwards down sliding, right? Because it has to slide along edges and there's no edge going this way. So then I would have to do something else, which I'll show you really quickly and hopefully I remember to talk about it again. If I wanted it to orient, so you can see the orientation of this is not aligned with this edge. So it's not moving straight up and down along the surface. It's actually moving along these axes right here that I have that aren't aligned with it. So something I like to do is I like to press D to activate my pivot point editing. And then I'd like to go ahead and hold Control and click on the edge that I want it to slide in the same orientation to. So I can click on that, and so it's going to reorient my transform tool so that it's going to align with that edge or vertice, whichever one you want to do. Press D to exit out of it, and now you'll see that this vertice is going to be essentially aligned and oriented to follow that edge, which makes it great for not, having it slide left or right or in different directions you don't want to. I just want it to move down to touch the scalp. So that's just pressing D to edit pivot point, holding Control and clicking on an edge. So I'll just show you. You can also do faces, right? You can do vertices, but I'm just choosing this edge right here that it's along that I want to kind of slide along. Press D to leave your pivot point and then just drag it. And of course, once I select something else, unless you have like your locked pivot points in your tool settings, you'll see it's going to reset back, which in my case, I like it to reset, but you can also pin it. So you can come in here and go, let's see, pin component pivot. So if I select this one, you can see it's going to keep that orientation. Okay, but I usually turn that off. Okay, cool. So we have our topology going the right way, right? So we have the cylindrical grid-like topology with a root and a tip opening cap. We made sure that the root is touching the scalp. And so now what we need to do is we need to make sure the direction of our guides knows which way is the root and which way is the tip. Because the XGen tube grooming tool doesn't understand, that this is this is intersecting this, so treat this as the roots of the hairs and grow out to the tip. It seems like it should be obvious, but again, it's a computer. You have to like kind of give it something. So the way that they control for the tube grooming, what is the root of the hair and what's the tip of the hair, is through the UV editor. And the reason why we have to define this is because the root is going to snap and lock to the scalp, and the tip is going to be free flowing. Like I can grab and edit and move around the tip, but I can't move the root. So it's really important to be able to set the root and the tip. And also when we're growing our hair and we're setting settings like the width of the root versus the width of the tip, or the color of the root versus the color tip, that direction matters. We want the hair that's growing from the scalp or down here to have its own settings versus the tip, and we want to control that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open the UV editor. And so it's kind of clever. It's also kind of weird that they did it this way. And the way it works is the bottom of the UVs, so in the V direction, so it's just throwing the V direction, which is up and down Y-axis direction on this grid. That is going to be the bottom down here is going to be the root, and anything up here is going to be the tip. And we'll go ahead and I'm just going to take this UV shell and I'm just going to go ahead and do a, let's see, a camera based. I almost always do camera based. Hopefully we can take a look at that later on to kind of see why that's advantageous with when it gets a little bit more complex. But I'll just do a camera based projection. So you can see it looks just like this, where we have the tips up here. Let's turn off that shading. There we go. So we have our root down here and we have our tip up here. And so it doesn't actually really matter that these all of these are down here and they're really close to the bottom, and all these ones are up here and they're really close to the bottom. But along the edge, like here, right? Along this edge, the tip of this edge and the root of this edge, the tip has to just be higher than the root. So I could actually take this UV right here, and it can be right there, and then this one can be like right here, and it'll still treat this one up here as the tip and this one right here as a root, just because this one is technically above this one, right? And your UVs don't have to be pretty for your tubes. Like, you can do essentially make them look as ugly as you want, as long as those tip UVs are up here and those root UVs are below the tip UVs, and the object actually has UVs, right? So usually I just do this really rough and dirty whenever I create new tubes, and just do something like this where I go ahead and just do camera based, right? So it's going to take your camera and essentially project it down to UVs. If I'm looking at like this, then the roots are going to be at the bottom and the tips are going to be the top of the UV space. So I just go create camera based. So it's just taking my current camera. If I had done it upside down like this and did camera, so we do camera based, then the roots are actually at the top and the tips are at the bottom, which is, obviously backwards and not going to be right. And we're going to keep it like that just so we can see how Xgen is going to give that feedback to you. So I'm only working right now with just one tube, and we'll move on to showing you with multiple tubes in a second. So I'm just going to take this tube, select, actually I don't need to select my scalp, I just need to grab the tube. And if you come over here to the primitives tab for my description that I'm working with, there's a tube groom setting right here. Go look at these settings. And so the first thing we're going to want to see up here is our tubes. So when you have your tube selected, and if you have multiple, like for instance in that example I showed at the beginning, I had like something like 250 tubes. Actually, I don't know if I had that many, but I had a lot. And so I had a bunch of tubes, and then you grab them and you click right here. And it's going to go ahead and populate those tubes you have into this space here. You don't have to really worry about the formatting, all that stuff in here. Don't worry. It's going to automatically do it for you, even if it looks a little strange. You shouldn't have to go in here and type and edit things. Make sure you're only selecting the geometry objects. Don't select groups. Don't select other objects that aren't important. That could mess it up. Okay. And then I'm going to skip this part for a second. We're going to come down here. Guide masks should stay 1. This is a setting that is really obnoxious, but when it's set to 1, I might be able to show it later. But when it's set to 1, this is essentially going to be cutting a percentage of your hair, or it's going to limit your hair to a certain length. And so you'll grow these guides. Actually, let's take a look at it in a second. Well, I'm going to reset this, and I think the default should be 1. Okay. So we'll come back to this. And then texels per unit, this is going to be your maps that it creates. So any maps that's going to create, like the region map especially, which is really important, it's going to be the density or the resolution of that map. So I like to set it something like 16 or 20. I think the default is probably something like 5, and that's sometimes not enough. And then CV frequency, you can hover over this, and it's going to tell you if you feel like the guides it's creating are kind of too low res, you can increase that CV frequency count. A lot of times I don't even need to mess with this, and it's a lot of times it's just mostly based on my geometry, so how many vertices I have, and if it's a pretty dense or smoothed mesh, then it's going to have enough CVs, and I don't really have to worry about it too much. And this is just for generating the guides. This isn't generating the hair itself, just the guides. Okay. So we'll come back to this cut parameter in a second. So let's come back up to guide spacing. So guide spacing is going to determine how many guides it's going to create on my geometry. So essentially the density of my guides. And if I click on this test button, and here we're going to see our initial problem, but you can see here that we have these little locators that are essentially showing us where the root of the hair is growing from. So we'll come back here in a second. But we can see our current problem right now is that it thinks the tips of my hair are roots, right? And that's because I did my UVs wrong on purpose, right? So my roots are up here and my tip is down here. That's the opposite. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and select this, go create camera based. Okay. And so now that's a good idea to delete history under tubes. I have this set up right here. So just delete history. And I'll come down here to tube grooming. And then I'll go ahead and load that in again, press test. You can see now my those roots, those locations of the roots are down on these vertices here. So the guide spacing is essentially going to be the density, and it's really limited by how many edge loops you have. So you can see my mesh. Let's take a look at this with that on there. You can see it's kind of essentially adding a root at almost every um, uh, edge loop, at the base of almost every edge loop. So even if I keep bringing this lower and lower and lower, click test, it's never going to get more than I have edge loops for. But if I go higher, I click test, it might actually be like so low res that you can barely get it. There you go. So you can see as I go higher, it's going to give me less guides that's going to generate. Let's go ahead and set that to 1, I guess, and click test. And let me turn off automatic preview. I think that's doing something. Okay, and then let's go ahead and turn that off, and I'll go ahead and click on generate. So it often takes a second. There are some instances where as it gets denser, it can take minutes. My current theory is that it has something to do with like storing something locally inside your project or inside the Maya files. I've tried testing so many times on like what could be causing it to be taking longer to do the tube groom generation, and it's the we'll talk about this later, but it's when it actually generates the region map, it has no problem generate the guides. That's really easy, but the map, the texture map that it's essentially creating to control the hair interpolation, that's the thing it gets stuck on sometimes. So usually if it's going really, really slow, I'll drop the texels per unit. And then sometimes I've actually just recreated the project. So I exported my tubes and I just reset up my Xgen in a different file. So here we can see the problem of that. Well, let's just go ahead and hide this first. So we can see the guides it creates, which is really cool. Don't worry about the colors. That's actually from my previous map, and I'll actually go ahead and disable the guide color for now. So we'll go in here, and I'm just going to go ahead and comment that out and just set it to, let's see, $A equals 1.0, click apply. And so now I just have a solid color. I could set it to orange or the default, but that's okay. Who cares? So we have our guide color, and here's our guides, and that's what it's generated. And when I create hair, it's essentially going to go ahead and create the hair to follow these guides that I created with my tubes. They're straight up and down, so you're not going to see anything special. So if I go ahead and show this, let me go ahead and pause this for a second to make sure I'm getting the right thing going. Here we go. I was just isolating something. So you can see it's following my hairs, right? And I'm going to turn off the region map for a second because that region map's actually kind of screwing things up. So I'll press 0, regenerate that. There we go. So you can see it's just essentially following that shape more or less. I mean, it's not a very complicated shape, essentially growing up and down, straight up and down. And then it's also controlling where the hair is growing, right? Because that's just depending on the guides, right? If there's no guides near the place on the scalp, it's not going to actually grow any hair. But there's like a certain region around each guide, it'll grow hair. So anyways, so it's following that shape. Cool. So we're going to go ahead and go back in. Again, the problem that I ran into here is what I was talking about earlier. Let's go ahead and show all these again because I'm not 100% sure which one it was. So we'll go here, 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 hide those ones. And I'll go ahead and hide the hair. Is that these guides aren't actually following all the way to the end. And so let me go ahead and make these tubes a little bit more interesting so that, you know, we can kind of get a better understanding of what these, how these tubes are helpful. Okay, I have a little bit more interesting example here. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to that tube grooming, and I'm just going to go ahead and load in this one, test it. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and generate. Takes just a second. And again, so there's some of these guides have an easy time getting to that tip, but you can see some of these ones back here aren't really quite getting there. So the problem is if I generated the hair there, well, besides these areas where it's kind of outside of the realms of my guides, if I ignore that part, you can see I'm kind of missing that shape that's up here because these guides right here haven't gone all the way up to here, right? And my hairs are only going to follow the length of my guides. So if there's no guides that go all the way up here, none of these hairs are going to go arc up like that. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that hair, hide those guides. Actually, so what we can do is if you ever want to regenerate the tube groom, we're just going to select the guides. You can click and drag over it, and it always prioritizes the guides. So you can kind of fairly easily or safely click and drag over the mesh, assuming you're not grabbing guides from other descriptions like my eyebrows, right? So if I have my eyebrow descriptions, I want to delete those too. Let me go ahead, so I don't want them. Come here, I can click and drag over here, delete it. It also creates these essentially center guides for each tube that you have, and you can safely delete that as well. And we'll bring back our tube. And I hope I have the tube. Didn't delete it. There it is. Okay. So we're going to drag that back in here and hide that one. Okay, so in order to get that guide to follow that shape, when I do that tube grooming, I'm going to come in here, I'm going to set that cut parameter to 0. And now when I click on generate, you'll now see that that tube, or that guide, follows all the way along the tube, and it's not getting cut to a max length. Okay, I'll delete those guides again, and delete that groom. If you need more guides, there's a couple things you could do. One is you could easily, like if you want to kind of keep the exact shape and not mess with the shape at all, you can come in here and go to edit mesh, add divisions. So that's just going to subdivide your mesh and give more divisions here. And oh, did it bevel? I'm going to do that for a second. Okay, there we go. I don't know if I accidentally pressed bevel or something else happened, but you can see it keeps the exact same shape, just has more edge loops. It's a good idea to delete your history whenever you do any kind of model edit to your tubes. I'm going to click on Tube Groom, and now when I load this in and test it, you can see I'm getting more guides. And I can go ahead and let's see if we bring this guide spacing down a little bit more and more guides. And I think 22 is actually the max edge loops are going up this way. And so now when I generate, I'm going to get more guides, which means that all the hair that's going to grow in these regions are going to more closely match this shape. So generally speaking, more guides is going to give you more accuracy, but you don't want to go too crazy on your guides early on. And, you just want to kind of be testing as you're going along and just trying to make sure all your tubes are working. You like the shape of your tubes, double checking that it's all the guides and the tubes are working correctly. And then as you go later on, you're trying to test the look of it and see if it matches accurately to the look you're going for. Then you can start increasing the resolution of your tubes. So I'm just going to Control Z that back. Ooh, I'm going to pause it. Okay, cool. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys multiple tubes. So I have these multiple tubes, and again, I'm hoping this is going to show you guys the benefits of working with tube grooming. So we're going to go ahead and grab all 4 of these tubes. You can see they're growing from the scalp, and they're all kind of snapping the scalp. There's some issues here, but we're going to talk about those later. First, so I'm going to go and open tube grooming, load these guys in, test it, and just double check, and it looks like they all know that the bottom edge loop from the UVs is that these are the roots. And I'm going to go ahead and click on generate. Before I do that, we'll dive into this in a second, but I'm going to delete this region map. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and test. And I have 40 guides. Click on generate. Might take a second, so let me go ahead and pause. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to go ahead and hide my tubes for now. And so you can see we have our guides following those shapes. And when I go ahead and generate this, right, it looks pretty good, but you can see there are some interpolation issues. Let's go ahead and hide those guides. And the reason for that is because essentially, well, actually, let's look at this with 0 interpolation. So we'll go ahead and press 0, regenerate those. Now you can see it's just kind of like a fuzzy mess, right? And so that is just because by default, what it's doing is tube grooming is just creating the guides first. And if you just had the guides by themselves, right, it gives a general shape direction, but it's not actually telling which hairs which guides to follow, right? Because all the hairs, they're just looking to their guides to understand what shape they're going to have, right? And so, of course, we're going to have more hairs than we're going to have guides, or you should. And so you can see we have like one guide here, but then like we have like maybe like 100 or so hairs growing in an area around it. And so a lot of the hairs are going to be close to multiple guides, right? They're not going to be right on top of one guide. You can see the hair that is actually growing right from this guide right here, like right at the base, like really, really close to it, are going to follow pretty close to the shape. But then the hairs that are growing between guides or the hairs that are growing away from guides, they have to guess. And so what they're going to do is they're going to essentially look at multiple guides and try to figure out what shape. So they're going to do what's called interpolating, right? They're going to essentially take multiple guides that are around them, and they're going to essentially do an average of the shape. And so that's by default what the behavior is going to be for XGen. And then we use something called a region map to control that interpolation. So I'm going to hop over into Photoshop and kind of break down some of this stuff for you guys. So this is how interpolation basically works, right? We have 2 guides here. We have a guide A and a guide B, right? And so this is how we, as artists, are able to control the shape of our hair without having to actually manually add and shape every single hair, right? We create guides, and then the hair that grows from the scalp follows these guides. And so if I come in here, when I grow the hair, you can see that the hair that is closer to this guide over here is gonna closely match this shape, and the same for this hair over here, close to this guide over here. They're gonna match the shape of the hair guides they're closest to. The hairs in between are going to average out based on distance their shape compared to the guides. So you can see as I get further away from guide A, these hairs are more closely going to take on the shape of guide B, right? And so, the further away it is, the more we're going to have influence from one guide to the other. You can see right in the middle, we have an equal blend of this guide A and guide B. So it's going to be the exact 50% average of the those two guide shapes. And so when we talk about tube grooming, what we're doing is let's go ahead and show this one. Here's my scalp. Here's two tube geometry meshes, right? So just imagine this is one of my tubes and this is one of my other tubes, one of my cylinders, right? And so when we generate with tube grooming, what it first does is it creates the guides, right? And these guides are essentially just following the shape of those tubes. So that's one part of tube grooming that is really helpful, right? We're generating guides based on shape of geometry. And then what it's also doing is it's looking at these tubes, let's hide the guides for a second, and where they intersect with the scalp. And what it does then is it creates what's called a region map. So the region map is essentially going to be coloring the mesh to say, essentially a zone of influence. So I'm going to hide these tubes. So when that yellow tube intersecting with the mesh creates this yellow region, what that's essentially doing is it's creating a zone of influence, or a region, which is essentially all the hairs that grow out of this are going to behave a certain way. And all the hairs growing out of the blue region are going to behave a different way, right? So it's a way that you can kind of group the hairs so that they behave or follow certain guides or certain directions, right? Instead of just freely interpolating between all guides, right? Because if we just used no region map, all of our hairs are just going to freely try to average out between all the guides that are between them, just like we're getting right now inside of Maya XGen, right? It's just all the hairs are just trying to match and average out their position. So I come back over here. Okay, so we create that, and in reality, they're not actually just perfectly matching the tubes, right? If anything, it just fills in the whole space with those colors. So if I have a bunch of tubes, right, obviously we're going to get more and more little regions and zones of influence. But in this case, I just have two tubes, right? So it's going to take up the entire scalp with just these two regions, right? So everything that's going to grow in the blue region, all the hair, is going to follow all the guides in the blue region, right? And all the hair that grows in the yellow region are going to follow the guides that are in the yellow region, okay? So if I create those guides, they're going to have that color of that region, right? So, right, they're going to pick up that color of that region map that it creates, and then all the hair that grows into those in those regions are going to follow just those guides. So if I just grew the hair without the region map, right, my hair would be doing like what it's currently doing inside of Maya, where the hair, that are close to the guides have a really easy time. They know what they're supposed to follow. But any hairs that aren't near any of the guides starts to kind of average or interpolate, right? So when we do this, though, so we're going to hide those primitives, and we're going to go ahead and show the color on the guides. There we go. And then the region, right? When we use that region map, what's going to happen is those hairs are actually going to follow the very specific guides, right? So because these hairs are growing in the blue region, they're only going to look at the blue guides. They're not going to look at any of these guides over here because those guides belong in the yellow region. And same thing with this area over here. All the hairs that are growing in the yellow region aren't going to be looking at the blue guides. They're only going to look at the yellow guides, which gives us much more control over the shape, and we're not getting that blending in between these tubes, right? The hairs only follow the tubes, okay? And so it looks something maybe a little bit like this if I hide that, right? And then if hide that one and just look at the hairs, let's hide the guides, right? That's what we get, which follows our tube. Okay, so that's kind of what we're aiming for by working with our tube grooming. Is it has a couple parts, right? It creates the guides from the geometry, creates a region map so that we can that's essentially intersecting the tube with the scalp, right? And it creates that region map. And then it uses that region map to control the interpolation of the hairs so that they're not just freely going between the objects and just trying to average out between them. It's following the shape of those tubes that we have. So that's essentially the basics of what tube grooming is and why it's so helpful. Okay, so if I come back in here, you can see I have my region mask off, and here's it's calling the region map that it creates. If I go ahead and turn that on, and then regenerate my hair, you can see it does a much better job. So that hair has a much easier time following the shape of the tubes or the guides. And you can see there's some areas where it's not quite matching, and we'll talk about that in a second. But essentially, it's doing a pretty good job, but you can see there's still some areas that it's having a little confusion on. And one way I like to visualize this is to color the guides, and I'm already coloring the hairs. Your hairs are going to probably be like a brown color, by going ahead and typing in this into the primitive and guide hair is $A equals map, and then this bit of code right here, which is parentheses, quotes, $description, / capital R region, and then calling that color. So we'll just, going to copy this whole thing, and I'm going to go ahead and also paste that into my guide color. Okay, click apply, click accept. And so now you can see that the guides are essentially colored like our region map. And let's actually take a look at our region map. We haven't looked at that yet. So let's take a look here. If I come out over here, and let's hide that. I could just delete that. I don't need that X Groom folder. And I'm going ahead and going to paint that guy. So let's go ahead and make sure it should be showing the region map. Let me just double check. For by default, XGen, if you create your region map with tube grooming, XGen isn't going to load in the actual region map. It's loading in because we're creating it outside of Maya's paint tool, like how we make most of our maps inside of Maya. With XGen, we're painting the maps in here and then baking them out as PTEX maps. But tube grooming actually generates the maps for you. So I'm going to, or the region map for you. So because we do that, Maya can't see that map itself. We would have to do some kind of conversion technique to get that as like a paintable texture so we can visualize it inside of Maya. But it would look something kind of like this. Let's go ahead and I'm going to really quickly paint this up. So it looks something like this, right? Where when you generate the region map, it's going to, use those tubes to create these regions that the guides are growing from. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hide. Actually, I'll keep these tubes. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at those guides, and you'll see if it works correctly, then on a single tube, all of the guides should have the exact same region color because all of those guides should be coming from the exact same location as that region map. But in this case, you can see that I painted it blue. It should be pink. I just didn't have the time. It's going to take forever to do this. So, if this whole blue region, all these guides should be blue, but you can see this, some of these are different color, right? And they're pulling from a different region, right? And that's because these tubes are so close to each other. They're actually literally right on top of each other that XGen is having a hard time understanding, is this guide supposed to be coming from this part of the region map, or is it supposed to be coming from this part of the region map or this part over here? So if your tubes are essentially touching at the roots or intersecting, then you're going to get inaccurate guide regions, right? So what's happening is this, and that's kind of why if I go ahead and hide that example tubes right here, right? If I generate that hair, right, you can see that these guides are essentially like the hair that's growing from right here, instead of using just these guides to control where the direction they're supposed to go in, it's also using these guides over here, right? Because it has these teal guides and they have these teal guides over here. And so the teal hair is essentially averaging between them, which isn't what we want, right? We'd want it only to average between these guys to get a very accurate shape. So in order to fix this, when we generate our tube groom, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to make sure our tubes also aren't intersecting each other. So I've come back out here and we have our tubes and you can see they're all perfectly intersecting each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and come in here, and on each of these tubes, I'm just going to barely shift them apart. Doesn't have to be a big shift. It doesn't have to be a big change. I'm just going to barely kind of separate them a little bit. And since I've already made the time to, make sure they're touching the scalp already, I mean, it could be better, who cares? it's not super important, or it's not that far off that's going to be a problem. I'm not going to really worry too much about, up and down away from the scalp. And also you can see I'm looking at it's easy for me to look at the surface, and that's because I turned on double-sided lighting. If I turned off that, you would be looking at the back faces of the normals. So that just makes it a little bit easier to see the backs of these normals. So I'll come in here, go over to this one, and we'll just go ahead and move this apart. Keep going. Actually, I don't need to move these ones right here, technically, because I already moved the other ones away from it. But I might just do it myself. And I'll move this one away here. Move this one away right there. And then the only one is these two. The only ones that are left is these ones that are overlapping. So let's go ahead and grab that. I'm just probably going to modeling toolkit and just separate those a little bit. So they just need to not be overlapping or intersecting. Okay, so now I'll come back out here. So we've already talked about the region map, and you're going to be constantly, ooh, did I separate that enough? Let me just go ahead and make sure I separate that just a little bit more. Okay. All right, so we talked about the region map and why it's important and what it does, right? Something that's a little quirky about XGen is you guys are going to want to keep rebuilding your tube groom, right? You're going to want to keep building it, building it, building it. The problem is, for some reason, well, maybe it's a good reason, I don't know. Every time you regenerate your tube groom, it doesn't regenerate the region map. It actually keeps your old region map, which means that everything's going to look, your hair interpolation is going to be wrong. It's not going to match your new tubes. If I cut this up into more tubes, right, I'm not going to get finer control. I'm still going to get that same exact kind of blending between my tubes as I had in my previous iteration because it didn't regenerate the region map. So what I like to do is I like to have this folder open, and I just go into, it's inside your project, right? You go to your project, you go to the XGen folder in your project, go to collections, the description, and you just delete the region map. I also like to delete the connectivity folder, but it doesn't really matter that much. Okay, so I just delete the region map folder. And then now when I recreate this, it's going to generate a completely new region map based on these new tubes. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and select these, go to tube grooming, and same process before, and we're just going to go ahead and generate. Okay, it's done generating. You'll get a little message that says failed to generate from region map, and don't worry about that. It's just because we deleted the region map. Initially, it's going to be like, hey, I can't find your region map, but it's going to create one for us. And then once you can see these aren't colored, even though I want them to be colored. But if I go ahead and you see they're actually drawing black because they're drawing from like a black region map or a non-existent region map. But as soon as I regenerate my hair, you can see it will colorize it. And you can see that these regions are much better, right? That interpolation is much cleaner. We're not getting any blending in between them. You are getting hair growing outside of the shapes, right? They're not kind of leaving the shapes, but that's not an interpolation issue. That's just because we don't have any guides in these areas, right? So we're actually growing hair out of, I guess you can't see them from inside. We're growing hair outside of the tube itself. And so since there's no guides to match that shape, it's just kind of guessing. Not really guessing, it's still using these guides, but it's not following that shape exactly. So that would be just a matter of we need more guides or we need to paint our density mask to exclude that area. Okay, so that's the basics of how to generate the tube grooming. And so we'll go a little bit deeper into the techniques of creating the tubes and just anything else I've ran into while I was working on it myself, different tools I used. But this is basic. The basic principles is we want to have that very specific topology and geometry to our tube grooming, our tubes themselves. We want to go ahead and lay out our UVs so that the root is at the bottom of the UV, the tip is at the top of the UV. We want to go ahead and make sure our tubes are not overlapping wherever they intersect the scalp, right? So that when we generate the region map, the interpolation is correct to those guides. And we use the region color for our primitive and guide colors to kind of double check that and make sure the guides and the hair, it helps you debug and kind of understand what's going on if anything's behaving the way you don't want it to behave. And as you need to keep regenerating this, easiest thing to do is just hide the hair, go ahead and delete the guides. It's not going to hurt anything. Delete this XG Groom folder or group. You don't have to, but I always do just to keep it clean. And then you're generally good to go. If you're like trying to delete the region map, so I come in here and try to delete that region map, and it says can't delete it, it's being file being used, just make sure you click on this button right here to clear the Xgen preview, and that'll just free it up so nothing's drawing from that region map. And then to finally clean it up, we delete that region map so that when we create a new one, it's going to accurately reflect our updated tubes. Okay, I have my character here, and so we're going to be building out our initial shell for our tubes. And so I'm going to go ahead and show my base mesh that I have, right? So in my case, I worked in ZBrush to block out my hair and get the shape going. You could be doing this by hand inside of Maya with multiple shapes. You can see this is all one mesh that's been merged together. However you want to block in the model, it's totally fine. You want to it's a nice to have this to kind of draw on top of so that you can kind of create the cage or the shell that you're going to cut into tubes. If you use something like ZBrush, or if you just kind of block in the shapes inside of Maya without kind of following this proper workflow, you're going to run into a very serious issue, which is density, right? And we'll talk about that in a second, but essentially, when I blocked this inside of ZBrush, I was paying more attention to the shape. I wasn't paying attention to the volume of my hair chunks and how they're growing from the scalp, right? Because ideally, right, I would be having, these, like all the hair and that shape of the hair should be growing from the scalp like a real human. Because this is going to be essentially like growing hair from an actual scalp. All that hair that is being created has to grow and start from somewhere on the mesh. And it's going to follow realistic density rules, right? And that's actually a good opportunity for me to pop in over here. And this might be jumping the gun a little bit, but I'm going to show you here. So I have down here my scalp, and we can go ahead and actually bring in the scalp from in here. I'll just drag this down to there, right? So we have our tubes on our scalp, and so this is where the roots of those tubes are. And you can see both of these tubes, they take up the exact same surface area of the scalp, okay? And so the problem is that the root or the volume actually of these tubes is not the same. So that means that this one over here is actually smaller in volume than this one over here, even though they're essentially growing the same exact amount of hair. So if I'm growing hair, right, they're taking up the same surface area down here on the scalp, they're going to grow the exact same amount of hair, right? So let's say in this case, I'm growing 6 hairs, right? But because of the volume is different, this one's like twice the size, right? Or maybe 3 times the size. This one, the volume of this density is going to be dense over here, right? It's going to be more tightly packed. And this one over here is going to be sparse, right? Because I'm taking the same amount of hair and spreading it over a larger area, right? And so if I measure the distance between these hairs, right, the spacing on this one would be like 1. The spacing on this one would be 3, right? So those hairs are going to be way less dense. So here's the example. Hopefully this helps a little bit kind of understand this or see this is, up here when we get to this root, right, there's a denser distribution of hairs because this is taking, let's say, in this case, like 9 hairs and distributing over a small area. And of course, on this larger one, we're taking the same amount of hairs and distributing over a larger area, so it gives less density, which makes it look in that area kind of like wispy or thin compared to another area which feels like really dense and chunky. So that's something we want to take into account when we're creating our tubes. And so that happens really easily if you just style your hair without actually thinking of the density of those tubes as you're going. And it's hard to go back and fix it, right? It's easier generally just to go ahead and start from scratch, and you use what you created for styling the shape, and you essentially use that as a template or a guide to work from. And it's really the only great way to get that density correct as you go along, is to kind of start from large and break it down smaller and smaller and smaller and keep editing and tweaking it and checking your density versus taking like an already sculpted mesh with no density in mind and just trying to fix it. So here is my, sculpted mesh. I'm going to use this as a template for drawing out the shape of my main tube. And it's going to essentially eventually look like this one, right? Let's go ahead and hide that. So you can see I changed the shape a little bit because I think I was using a different one, but you can see that this is kind of just like our basic first subdivision shell, right? And what we're going to be looking at is when we kind of look at that, we're going to like if you sculpted or you created a shape for model for shaping and styling the kind of volume of your hair, a lot of times you're also not thinking of where it's intersecting the scalp. And if I was to look at this without the character, most likely, let's take a look at that scalp, right? You can see a lot of this is just ignoring the scalp, not even paying attention to it. It's not even touching it or even close to it. But what we're going to want is, let's go ahead and hide that hair scalp. I'll go here. You can see I have, I kind of did this with curves to kind of show you, right? We're going to want to find where our hair is going to start at the root and go all the way down to the tip, right? So we're going to essentially connect from the roots down to the tip. And I'll show you guys how I did it. And so let's go ahead and pull this hair sculpt up. Okay, so one way to do this is just going to be essentially taking this whatever your base sculpt or object you use for shaping, and we're just going to go ahead and set as a live surface. And so my personal preference is to use Quad Draw. So I like Quad Draw a lot. It's under Mesh Tools, Quad Draw. I have it right here on this bar right here, and we're just going to go ahead and click on Quad Draw. And what you're going to do is you can just start really basic, right? I'm just going to go ahead and start from the roots, go down, follow kind of the shape, go down to the tip, and then I'm just, not right there, not right there, and then come over to the next one over here. And I'm not going to go over how to use Quad Draw. That's, it's just a completely different video, right? So and you can see I'm kind of not getting enough resolution in there, so I might need to get that right there because it's going to be a pain in the butt to clean up. Add just a little bit more resolution. Come down here. There we go. And so we're just going to do this all the way around. And so I might just go ahead and do something like this, where I'm just going to go ahead and extrude, right? Something like that. And we're going to have to kind of think about that density issue, right? So because we're growing it from the scalp, and we're going to have, the hair is going to grow from the scalp and it's going to come all the way down to here, right? So let's go ahead and show you guys a really quick example, hopefully. Just go ahead and block that in really quickly. Maybe add that one right there. The more subdivisions I add to this, it's going to be harder to get all the way around. It's better to get the general block in volume and then add more subdivisions to it, just to speed it up. But anyways, so you can see here that this is pretty proportional, right? Let's say this length right here is 5 units. This is 1/5. This is 2/5 and 2/5, right? So this is 2 units, 2 units, 1 unit. And down here, this is maybe 1 unit. This is 2 units and 2 units. These are kind of equal in size. But if I came over here and drag this over, and let's just go ahead and relax that so that it does that. And so this is like length of 2, length of 2, length of 1. You can see that the hair is going to grow from here, is going to, kind of be, essentially 40% of the hair density. But then it's going to occupy, 40% of the hair is going to occupy like 20% or 10% of the density down here, right? So it's going to condense down here. And then I'm going to take very few hairs and then stretch them out wide. So I'm going to get that density issue. So when you're blocking out these edge loops that follow your shape going from the scalp down to the roots or tips, you want to go ahead and make sure that you're trying to get corresponding edge loops to, or poly loops, I guess, to have kind of relative density or scaling compared to their neighbors, right? So if this is 1/5 of this area up here, this one over here should be 1/5 of this area over here. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that over. If you're doing something like me, right, where you sculpt this in ZBrush, you might actually be breaking that rule while you're sculpting it. So you might have to just kind of redirect or change the flow of your hair. And that's just something that we'll have to get used to. Something else too is if we took a look at, so I'm just going to go ahead and hide that. I'm going to hide this hair sculpt for a second and take a look at the root to the tip. You can see I'm growing the hair essentially from as much of the scalp as I can, right? You don't want to really you want it to grow out from realistic places, right? You want to actually have a realistic hairline. That is, if you can actually see the hairline on your character. If it's covered by hair, covered in hair, like mine is going to be, and blocked off, and you're never going to see where the hair connects to the scalp, you can kind of get away with faking things, right? Because normally I'd have like sideburns and maybe like hair transition on the temples, and then like this would go down the neck a bit more. But because that's completely blocked by my hair, I'm not really caring about it. But this is the general kind of shape you want on the scalp. Is you want it to just kind of follow all the way around, like your hair is growing from your head. If you want to, you can look up someone with a shaved head to kind of see the area that the hair grows from, right? All the way around, and then up to the, peak where your bangs would be growing. But then you have this hairline, right? And so essentially it's like this internal line that goes in here, because if you look at your hairline, if you have longer hair, look at where the hair parts. This is the hair part. Sorry, I said hairline, hair part. Essentially hair is going to be growing in a direction from this area right here, because you usually split the hair in two different directions unless you're doing like an afro or spiky hair, right? So this is where we're going to be parting our hair into different directions, and generally it's going to be, if you're doing long hair, something like this. And if we look at the hair sculpt, right, you can see that the hair is growing from, this is where it's parting. So this is where we're kind of creating the boundaries of our guides, because let's go control vertex. So the hair that corresponds to here down to here on the root, is on one side of that part, but then on the other side of the part, the hair is growing and going in this direction. So this is how I make my shell, is I go ahead and, make sure I'm kind of drawing that hair part in and extruding in that way. And if I'm doing it kind of like with that quad drawing, it just, for me, it kind of naturally happens. But this is what it's going to kind of look like if it was intersecting the mesh. And so, this point right here on the root is going to connect to this part on the tip, right? And if we look at our hair sculpt, right, this point on the root is going to come down here to this point on the tip. And then when you get into the actual like back of the scalp, the back of the head, then we're going to have, the hair that's growing from back here is going to come down to here. And then everything in between growing on the scalp, let's go ahead and hide the sculpt. Everything in between is just going to fill in this space in the middle. So it's going to be the in-between volume. We're defining the boundaries of this volume. And so that's what we're doing with our quad draw, or whatever technique you want to use. Okay, so I'm just going to keep going a little bit further. I'm not going to complete the entire thing, but I do want to show you guys a little bit more. So I'll take that and make sure that hair sculpt, is set to live target, and we're just going to select our mesh, our cage mesh, or shell that we were creating, and I'm just going to keep going around, and I'm just going to go ahead and actually block in the roots right now. So I'll go here and block it in like this. And so you can see I'm kind of blocking in that hair, or I'm actually like modeling in that hair part right here. I'm going ahead and thinking about it. You gotta be careful with it if you're using quad draw, so it doesn't snap one side to the other side. But something kind of like that, which if you're using quad draw, you can just decrease the snap distance right there to right here. Okay, so that's going to be, we're going to have to do something kind of like this. Our roots right here on the outside, we're going to have to also do the inside. And I'm just going to go ahead and pull it down to the tip. And I'm not going to worry too much. I'm going to get kind of messy here. It'd be great if better if I can get some resolution here so it doesn't just go straight through, because cleaning that up is kind of a pain in the butt. But it's going to kind of go around along the outside like this, and then go all the way around the back. I'm not really paying attention to how many I will have to in a second. Right around here. And so, right, I can, let's do it right there. Right, so this one right here is going to go up to here. This one right here might go up to here. Let's go ahead and add one more subdivision there. This one right here might go to there. This one right here would go to here. Subdivide that one more time. This one would go here. This would go to here. And yeah, I didn't do it right. Let's do that one right there. This one would go here. And this one would go here. And I still need one more, but it doesn't matter. So you can see this is, growing from the root down to the tip, and that's kind of how we would start that. So you could lay it out this way, the way I just did it here, where you're kind of laying out the strip along the roots and then laying out the strip along the tips, and just to kind of think about it. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get the inside. So what I'm going to do is, since this I can't see my scalp and I can't draw on the scalp because this is so close, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and draw the inside or the back of the hair, right? So this is the hair that's falling down along the back of the neck. And if you have like let's say an updo or pigtails or a ponytail, this might be a little less complex and a little bit straightforward in the shape. But if you have like long hair that like this one, figuring out where it grows along the scalp and where it corresponds to the end of your hair can be a little bit confusing. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull that around to that side. I'm not going to worry about it too much. Okay. And I'm actually going to hide this because on the inside, I'm not really caring about the shape because I can't see it. I can try to match it a little bit better, but using quad draw and seeing the scalp at the same time is a little pain in the butt. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that. And so I'm going to come back in here with the quad draw. Let's go ahead and hide the hair. We'll go back into quad draw. Let's see. So again, extending this, I'll go ahead and add something like that right there. So extending this root, and let's go ahead and in this case, I'm going to go ahead and have this snap to the scalp. So I'll select the scalp and let that be the snap target now. And what we would probably want to do is we'd probably want to go ahead and grab the all of this right here along the part of the hair. So let's just go ahead and go here to here. And we're just going to move it in the y-axis so it snaps down to the scalp. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and essentially extend out the root. So let's go back to quad draw. And I'll just kind of follow along the hairline, right? So this is going to be for, if we take a look at this, this is going to be that root hair. And you can see I'm not actually following it very well. So pull that back. And we could probably take a look at this from the back side. I think I have to turn on backside editing for that. And I might go ahead, I'm just going to select that scalp. Oops. And I'm going to select these guys right here. Select that scalp, and I'm just going to isolate them so that I don't have to, I'm not messing around with the outside part. And go back to selecting that as a live target, and then come back here, and then using quad draw to keep going. You can still see it, but it's not going to get in the way. So this goes around here. This goes down to there, here, and along the nape of the neck. And I'm not going to go all the way around. We'll stop right around here. And we're going to just connect that to the root. So the problem here is, since I'm extruding it along like a poly edge, a polygon edge right here, that we're getting this kind of like extra edge, like this edge right here. We don't actually want it to snap to the scalp, so we'll probably like recreate that or delete it. I just really want this edge right here to snap to the scalp. I know this is a little abstract looking at me editing this and doing this real time. I apologize. So ask me if you have questions. Like this is just how I'm creating it. You can create it a bunch of different ways, and I'll show you guys really quickly the concept behind one other idea or direction, but I just wanted to kind of show you this. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to, let's go ahead and bring that back. Let's isolate this scalp right here. And what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to have these edge loops here connect down to these edge loops down here. So this one right here should connect all the way down to this one right here. And I can go ahead and just bridge that if I wanted to, but then connecting that is going to be kind of a pain in the butt. So what I can do is, again, I can bring back that hair sculpt. Let's go ahead and then I'm going to go ahead and set that hair sculpt as the live target. Go back to quad draw. And this gets a little hard to look at. I'm going to go ahead and hide the scalp. But then I can go ahead and start extruding like maybe this midpoint right here in. So I might go ahead and go to quad draw. Oops. Let's go to here, object mode, quad draw. And extrude that there. And extrude that here. I can kind of start lining it up with the how many edge loops are on this. So there's like 1, 2, 3 that are going to be kind of going down here. It'd be helpful to, you can also draw like a curve or draw on the mesh to kind of get an idea of which direction they're going to go. So I'll come over here. And so I need 3 right there. And then what I can do is I can just start, connecting them. So I'll just go right there. Let's add 3, make sure it has 3, and then just start connecting. So connect that one right there, connect that one to that one, connect that one to right there. Okay, and then I can connect these to the root. So I'll just go ahead and come up here, and I'm just going to go ahead and I'll just bridge these ones instead. So I'll select that to, I think it's here. So I'll go ahead and bridge, and this one to there. Oh boy, this is getting complex. Let's see, I think it would be this one to here. There we go. And then this one to there. And then I can, this is getting a little too, I think the word I would use is esoteric. It's a little too like crazy, and I apologize to anybody watching this. But I'm going to come in here and let's go back out, and I can just smooth that area down a little bit. So I would keep going around, and I'd keep connecting down to here, and then get that so that goes all the way around the head on the inside. And so when I'm done with it, I will have something that looks a bit like this, right? So you can see where it's connecting along that root, right? Or that, yeah, root, and then it goes all the way to the tip, and it's flowing that way that I was just indicating, right? I'm trying to figure out where a hair would grow from the roots, follow its path all the way down to the tip, and we're just drawing the perimeter, right? We want the perimeter of where our hair is going to grow from the roots, and where the perimeter of where our hair is going to go around the tip. So we're essentially creating a cage on the outside, okay? And so this is what we should end up with. So let me show you really quickly one other way of doing this, creating that hair shell, and hopefully maybe this is an easier way. So the other way that we can generate this initial shell is that we're going to use this EP curve tool. You can find it on the curve surfaces or underneath the curves menu. Or it might be the create menu. Yeah, the create curve tools, EP curve tool. And so with the essentially our proxy shape as a live target, what we can do is we can do something very similar to the quad draw. But what we're going to do is we're going to draw out our curves, and then we're going to loft between them. So this would be easier if you're not very comfortable with quad draw, and sometimes it's easier to think of because it's kind of showing the vertical spans. You're not really worrying about the horizontal at all. And so it might be easier for you to visualize and think about this as you're working. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to do something very similar, where we're going to go ahead and take this EP curve tool and just draw the direction that our hair is going to grow from the scalp down to the tip, and press enter, and then press G to reactivate the tool. So when you're doing this, you want to go ahead and make sure that when you're doing like these tight curves, you're going to have to create more essentially curve points in order to make sure that you match the shape. So if I went like from here to here to here to here to here, right? If I go ahead and turn on X-ray, you can see that's like kind of losing a lot of that shape because I don't have enough curve points. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just make sure I have enough curve points at, really curved surfaces. Come down to here. And again, I'm not quite worrying about density as I should, just for time's sake. I should be, again, thinking about how wide it is from the roots versus how wide it is from the tip, and just make sure it's proportional along the ends to what it is up here. I'm just going to keep going. I just want to get some example shapes to show you guys how to then generate the mesh. Press enter. I'll add one more right here, I guess. So we'll go here. And we don't have to worry about making sure these knots, these curve knots I'm adding, actually match, because we're going to rebuild these so that they all have the exact same knots. If you don't know why and what that means, don't worry about it. So here again, because these meshes kind of overlap and it's a little hard to see the scalp, we're gonna have to go ahead and edit and tweak this in a second. Or actually what I could do is, let's go ahead and take that hair sculpt, and I'm gonna go ahead and hide it. I'm still snapping to it, and we're gonna try it this way. So now our hair is going to, or our scalp is going to go along the inside, right? Just like that root curve. Oh no, tip curve, right? So we're going to follow along that hairline of where the hair is going to grow from, right? And so I'm going to take that, still with that EP curve tool. So I'm going to go ahead and Control Z that. Let's go ahead and show that root. I have those backwards. This is actually a root curve. I don't know why I called it the tip curve. So I'll go ahead and use that EP curve tool. And I'm going to start from here. You can see I'm actually like snapping to the outside, so I'll maybe click it from inside here, which hopefully is on the inside of that um, uh, sculpt that I created. And I'm just going to have this one go all the way down here. Oh, and so you can see, since I can't see my sculpt, that's a problem. So I'm going to go ahead and show that again. And then come back down to this one and continue that shape. So this one's going to go down to here, press enter, and I'm just going to kind of eyeball it because I don't want to keep snapping back and forth between that scalp. You can always fix it or go back to it and fix it later. So I'll go here, 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 and I would go all the way around, just like I would with the when I was quad drawing it. And so let's go ahead and hide that sculpt. I would want to make sure it's kind of snapping to the scalp. If it's not, I'll come in here and I'll just grab this control vertex and we'll just turn that off. And then we'll just hold V to snap to the vertice, and we'll just make sure that the root of this is snapping to the scalp. Right? Oop. Okay, I don't want to get rid of that. Let's see. I think this other one is pretty good. Let's go ahead and just grab that control vertice, and I'm just going to move and snap it to this the scalp right there. Okay, so I'm just going to work with what I have right here. And let's hide this other curve so we're kind of not getting confused by that. So this is only part of my shell, right? It's going to go around on the outside right here. Well, the main idea is once you have all your curves, what you're going to do is you select your curves in order, right? So going from one to the next, right? So we're going from here to here to here in this direction. Right? If I select those out of order, then it's going to draw the surface and bounce around, right? We don't want that. We want them to go in order. So once I have those curves selected, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rebuild them because we want them to have essentially the exact same number of vertices. So I'm going to come over here to curves. We're going to rebuild. And here's my settings, right? I just set it to cubic, and I'm just using a pretty good density because my hair has a lot of shapes to it. If your hair is pretty simple, you could probably use less, but it's not going to hurt any. But you do want to know kind of what this number is. So I'll click apply. You won't notice anything, but now these all have the same exact number of CVs, right? If I come in here and go to CV, control vertex mode, you see it has 25, 25, 25, right? So they all have the exact same number. I'm going to close that. And again, I'm going to go, well, okay, I didn't need to select them in order to do the rebuilding. I'd need them for this next part. So I didn't actually need to select them in order at that point. So I'll select those, and I'm going to go ahead and go to surfaces, and I'm going to go ahead and open these settings, and we're going to loft them. And I'll show you what it looks like. It's going to look something kind of like this, right? So you can see it's lofting a polygon surface between those curves. And let's take a look at those settings. So these are the settings I found that worked really well for me. I'm going to be outputting polygons, and I'm going to scroll down here. Let's make this bigger so you guys can see the whole thing. And types are quads. We need quads. And the tessellation method I'm using is general. So what I like about this is I can actually set the polygon shell it's going to create to match exactly how many curves I have and how many vertices those curves have. So I have, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I have 7 of these. And then I'm going to have essentially 25 points. So you might have to play around with this a little bit, but this one right here, I think the V direction is going to be going this way. So it's essentially the number of curves I have. So that's 7. And the U direction is going to go up and down the curve, which is going to essentially be how many points I have. I can use less. It doesn't have to be the same amount. I'll click on 24. I might have this backwards, but we're going to see. Click apply. I don't. So you can see that this is going to be matching those curves. And actually, I guess, do I not have this that number correct? Is that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7? Okay, so I might be missing something or messing something up. Let's try 6. Click apply. Or actually, let's try 8. Click apply. Okay, I'm getting something here. I probably have to play with these settings a little bit so that they actually match the curves. There's something here that I'm not quite catching, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. But that would be essentially how another way we can create our shell. And if you need to come in and add more resolution, you would just add another curve in here. And you can delete and create new curves really easily. And you just, again, select them in order and then use loft to generate that shell between them. Okay, once we have our first shell, the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go ahead and check your density. So we have our shell here, and it's essentially our first tube, right? It's just one big gigantic tube. So we're going to come over here to our description, and I'm going to go ahead and run tube groom. So we're just going to go ahead and take tube groom, load in this geometry, test it to make sure it knows what the root and tip is. If it doesn't, then we're going to have to, of course, lay out the UVs, but in this case it does, right? So you can see it's drawing along the scalp, along the roots. And you can see there's some in-between ones. When you create these tubes, it's also going to generate guides in the middle of the tube. And since I have one big tube, we have this kind of like averaged center guides right there. So don't worry about those too much. We want to look at the guides that are along the root of the hair, or the roots of the shell. So I'll go ahead and click on generate. If my settings are correct, it should look something like this. It's going to go ahead and try to generate the hair. I'm going to go ahead and pause it. Oh, there we go. Okay, never mind, I don't have to. So you can see the guides that are along the shell are really good, right? They're actually following the shape exactly, going from root to tip. These interior guides that weren't actually following the shell, but that the tube groom really wants to create for itself, I'm going to go ahead and select those. Make sure I'm not selecting any of the outer ones. Oops. And I'm going to go ahead and delete those inside ones, because they're not really following any shapes and it's just going to be a little too chaotic. But yeah, so those are following good. I could go ahead and do a density test, and you'll see that it's not great. So we'll go ahead and click here. So it works okay, but in this middle area right here, because there's no guides for it to follow, it's just kind of trying to follow and match the outer guides. And you can see I have a region map that I should probably get rid of. Let's go ahead and not generate that, or get rid of that region map because we don't actually need it. So if it's holding it up, just come in here, click on that button right there, come in here and try again. And it's not doing it. That's interesting. Probably because I have the guides colored by it. So because the guides are colored by it, it's still going to lock it. I might just go ahead and delete those guides and just regenerate it. So come over here. Just delete that there. Let's try that again. I'm doing the, yeah, it should delete it for me. Try again. There we go. Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and recreate that tube groom without the region map there. And here's our result here. So obviously we're getting some of that interpolation issue in the middle. I had to pause and do a little editing and tweaking because it's a little confusing to look at if you don't know what's going on. But generally speaking, this in-between area is going to have a really hard time because there's really no guides nearby, and it's having a hard time just trying to guess what it's supposed to be. So that'll be solved when we go in and start actually breaking our main shell into multiple shells. But one quick check you can do is you can look at it from above and just kind of see on the outsides if that density or that spacing is kind of even across it. You can see back here it's getting a little denser. You have to be careful. It's kind of misleading because I actually have this interior guide that if I didn't have it, let's go ahead and delete that one. I get like this kind of weird bald spot in the back. And that's just because, this just isn't a great setup so far, right? Because it's just, there's not enough guides in here. So you got to be careful of just reading too much into it this early stage. But anyways, so once I'm there, check the density or just check that it's generating okay. And then I'm, good to move on to the next step. If your shape of your hairs aren't matching, right, your guides very well, you just probably have to increase your modifier CV count. So mine's up to 40 because I have a lot of very specific shapes I'm trying to hit. Don't go higher than you need to because then that just increases the density, the resolution of your hairs, which is like increasing your poly count more or less. Yeah, so we're at this point. It's good to go. I'm going to go ahead and degenerate the hair. I made sure I deleted all my guides. And then I'm going to also go ahead and delete my region map. Okay, next we're going to want to go ahead and cut this into smaller pieces, right? So it's just going to give us more guides in the middle, and it's just going to let us, our first goal is to just get more guides in this middle area and just make sure we have guides actually growing from here and getting the shape we want, so that we can control the density in this middle volume better. And then after that, what we're going to be using is we want more tubes, I've said guides, but tubes, so that we can essentially control the shape. So we can actually start shaping the clumps into more specific styles or more specific shapes. So what I'm going to do is I have this subdivision one here, and what I do is I'm just trying to make this non-destructive, so I just make a duplicate of it, I group it, right, and then I start splitting it to pieces. And so the next subdivision level, I just call them sub Ds, right, Shift H, is going to be splitting it to two, right? So you can see I've split it into two, and in this case, I'm going symmetrical. If you can work symmetrical, that's great. So in this case, I was just doing one side and I was just going to mirror it across. But I'll go ahead and show you guys what that looks like. So we'll go ahead and hide that, Shift H. And so what I'm going to do is we'll go ahead and duplicate this one. I'm going to put it in a group, and we're going to call this one, we'll call this one level 2. Okay. Inside of level 2, we'll hide this subdivision 1. And I'm going to go ahead and essentially we're going to find where to bridge across or cut our shell into more pieces, or essentially cut it in half. So this edge loop right here, if I was to cut it in half, we would get an edge that would go, well, we can control where it goes, right? I can have cut it across and it would bridge across this way, and then we'd have like this really big shell and this smaller shell over here. But it's easier to just go ahead and cut this into quads, or quadrants, not quads, 4. So we're going to select this edge loop here, and then we're going to select this edge loop right in the back. I'm going to detach them. So detach this shell into multiple pieces. And since I'm doing symmetrical, I delete this other one. If I'm not symmetrical, what I would just do is split these. So I would just do Shift right click and then separate, extract. I can't remember what it is. It is separates two parts, mesh, separate. Yep, there we go. So separate into 2 separate meshes, and in my case, I'm just going to delete one of them. All right, so now what we're going to do is we can solo and isolate on this is we're going to bridge across. So we're going to go from this side right here to that side over there and click on bridge. And you can see, especially early on, it's going to take a lot of editing. So you can see how much that's kind of crunching down. And if I come in here, you can see how much that's penetrating through the mesh, which is an issue, right? Through the scalp. I'm not going to have a lot of control for it. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a subdivision to this. And I'm going to go ahead and focus on just getting this, this part right here to touch the scalp. And so I'm going to have to move a lot of these vertices this way. So I'm going to go ahead and select this, maybe turn on soft select and start moving these vertices back. I can move them back one by one, but obviously that's going to be way too tedious. When you're doing this though, you really don't want to mess with the vertices you've already fixed to hit the scalp, right? So if I'm using soft select, there's a chance that, I'm going to move those vertices up there. And I don't want to do that. And I might not even want to move these vertices out here because I got a really specific shape. I'm just trying to get these vertices here. So one thing you can do is you can select these vertices and then invert your selection. And then you can come over here to the channel box, click on CVs right here. And we're going to go ahead and select the first one all the way to the bottom one. And we're just going to go ahead and lock. So we'll go ahead and lock selected. So I'm locking those vertices. And so now when I come in here and use soft select, you see I'm not affecting those locked ones because they're locked. So I can come in here and I kind of want to keep this again planar with this edge right here. I don't want to move them left and right because that's going to cut into the other shell. So if you need to, you can orient it or align it to that face right there. In this case, it's already lining up right here. So if I align it, you can see it's not actually, really changing it that much. And so then I'll just come in here and push this back to right around there. And this in-between area, especially since I'm not seeing it, I don't really have to care about it too much. But what I do want to get is, you see this cut goes halfway at the tip versus halfway at the root. But you see the root is not halfway, right? This is much longer than this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and move that up until I can get it to be about halfway. So we're going to go ahead and keep moving this up to about right here. And there's a lot of different ways you can do this. And you can see I'm actually not quite getting it to align there. So I'm actually going to go ahead and reset that pivot point. So I'd have to play around with this a little bit more, but I'm not going to worry about it right now. So I'm going to move this kind of up here, and I could use something like a sculpting tool to kind of smooth that out or relax it. You can see now it's not 50%, maybe something right around here might be 50%, like this length is the same as this length. Okay, and I might need to do the same thing down here. Let's make that soft select a little lower. Okay, and let's go ahead and drag that back a a little bit more. So it's just touching the scalp. Okay. And we can fix this right here. So these edge loops, you can see how this edge right here is overlapping with this other one and these faces kind of get gnarly. That actually doesn't really matter, right? Because when we create our guides, they're just following along these vertical or long edge loops. They're not really caring about how they connect to the other edge loops, to be honest. So you don't really actually have to worry if there's like intersections going in the U direction or along the widthwise. You just want to make sure it's kind of matching the shape you want. So in here, I might use like a sculpting brush, or yeah, I'd use maybe sculpting brush. Let's turn on the wireframe unshaded so we can see this. And I'm just using this relax brush right here. And that's just going to kind of average it out. And you can try it. You can see it's going to start shrinking my mesh, so it's not quite working right there. But there's a lot of different ways we can just if you need to, you can just manually move these and tweak these. But I'm just going to try to the more we clean it up at this stage and get it to looking the way we want to, the easier it's going to be later on. So what I might do is, because I like where this vertex right here is touching the scalp, what I might do is I might also lock that CV. So I'll select that CV, lock it. So I'll just go ahead and lock selected. And so now I'm just cleaning up and editing these vertices in between. I might do the same thing down here. Select that, lock it. Okay. And so now I can come in here with soft select and I can massage this into essentially the shape I want it to be. So I might have these guys come down here a little bit more, right there. Just keep adjusting my soft selection so I'm getting kind of like a clean transition. And I'm not going to spend too much time cleaning it up, but there we go. So we got that going. There's something weird going on up there. I'm not sure what that is. I think that should be fine. And then what I would do is I would then go ahead and come back in here and I would probably, subdivide it. Whoa, let's go ahead and select this. We're going to go ahead, edit, delete all by, or delete by type history. And so we don't have snapping on, so it shouldn't snap. There we go. I think the history is kind of messing up with it. And so we'll just subdivide it a little bit more. You don't want to go too crazy initially, because you do want to, if you can get that initial vertex to hit the scalp, then it's a lot easier to work with. Let's turn that off. And I'm just going to kind of do the same thing where I'm just going to come in here and snap that there and snap that there. And because this is like curving a lot, like it goes up and then goes down, and then it's like sitting this like it's, and then this curves up and then goes down, curves up and goes down like in real hair. Up here it's going to take a lot of editing. Down here it's going to be pretty straightforward because it's just going in a straight line instead of doing like this really big bend. So it can be really annoying if you have hair like this, that flows and falls down. But it's just something that once you've gotten it kind of set up it correctly, initially everything else should go smoothly from there. So I'm just going to kind of move that out. And I might, again, select this vertex that's right on the edge, lock it. So I'll just go ahead and lock this one, lock selected. And then let's just go ahead and move those vertices next to it away, right? So you can see it's popping off this way. And here I could use that, like the sculpting brush maybe, because I lock those vertices. They shouldn't move when I use that sculpting brush. They shouldn't. If they are moving, there is a chance they are. No, they're not. You can use freezing on it with the sculpting tools. I'm just going to go ahead and get that relaxed. And like I said, it's not always it's going to shrink down, so it's not always going to get the shape you want. So yeah, I would keep editing like that. So it's connecting the scalp. I would do it on the other shell if it's asymmetrical. If it is symmetrical, then what I would just do here is I would just do poly modeling, mirror. Oh, let's go ahead and mirror this object. Mirror. And okay, something weird's happening. So let's just go ahead and make sure I got that going. Delete history. I have a bunch of different areas where you can delete history. And then we're just going to go mesh mirror. Okay. Or actually, we don't want to mirror it. We want to actually duplicate it. So I'm just going to duplicate that. And on this duplicate, I'm going to mirror it across the x-axis. So set the x scale -1, freeze it. And then I can't see it right now because I have double-sided on lighting. If I turn that off, you can see the normals are backwards on this one. So I do mesh display reverse. And of course, delete my history. And then like I was doing earlier in that example, I would want to go ahead and split these guys. Lighting, two-side lighting, away from each other, right? I'd want them to not overlap here. So I'd just give them a little distance so that when I generate that region map, it's not going to get confused, right? And so, I'm going to go ahead and hide this one and show this other one. And you know, I just keep going, right? In this case, I, mirrored them across, and then I also cut them into four. So I just divided each side into two, again, using that exact same method, right? Where I just go ahead and we'll hide this one and show this one, right? Where I'm just going ahead and selecting like the edge on this side, and then an edge on, let's say, this side. And I'm going to cut them there and then bridge them across, right? And then I get two shells. So cut, separate them, and each of those bridge them across. In this case, I would have to edit each of those manually. And I actually might show this one. I know this is getting kind of long, so feel free to skip forward if you already know how to do this stuff. But I'm going to select this. I'm going to go ahead and detach and separate and delete history. Okay. And so in this case, I can't mirror this like across each other, right? I will mirror it across the x-axis, but I can't, mirror them to match each other. But we can do something that's kind of tricky because I'm going to bridge across on one of them and fix it just like I was doing like with the center line. But you can see that, as you saw, that was like, it's kind of tedious. And let's just go ahead and go into it. So we're going to go here. And so what's going to happen is I'm going to bridge across from this side to that side, right? From the outer part touching the root to tip, from the inner part touching root to tip. I'm just going to go ahead and bridge across. So let's go ahead and bridge. So I'll show this while we're here is I'm going to actually detach these again, because by how many edge loops are going across this way, it gets a little hard to edit, right? That shape. Actually, this shape's actually pretty dang good. But, with all those vertices, getting this curve and matching it is kind of annoying, kind of like you saw how I was doing on this other one where it was like getting a little too crinkly because it just had too many vertices for me to edit. So what I can do here, though, is I bridged it across, so I have this shape, and I'm going to go ahead and actually detach it. And on this detach, I might actually manually disconnect these edge loops, or delete these edge loops. So I'm just going to go ahead and reduce the topology of this a little bit, not all the way down. And so then that way, if as I'm editing this vertice or this middle line here, it's a lot less for me to have to deal with. So there's so many different things you can do. And I know this gets kind of confusing. And you're going to have your own workflow that you really like. So, there's no wrong way of doing it. And some of these things are just things that over time, I kind of picked up and sped up my workflow. Okay. So as we get there, let's make sure it penetrates the mesh correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off, and you can see it's not. Let's hide this other one. So I'm going to come in here. And so I'm just going to go ahead and make sure I'm moving these guys. So I'm going to go ahead and align that to this and use that soft select. So we're just going to move it there. Let's move these together until that one, it touches the scalp. And again, since I cut this edge loop goes half through the root right here, we want to make sure this is also half, and it's not. So I'm just going to move it over here a little bit. So we'll come back out here to there. And again, because I have less of them now, this is a lot easier for me to clean up. And I'm not worried about this being on one flat plane right now. Because the way we're going to approach this is going to make it a lot easier. I can come in here to the modeling toolkit and just do transform constraint to surface slide. So we're just going to move that. Okay. And we're just going to go ahead and just get that as an easier curve going down like that. Right? And because there's less vertices, that's a lot easier to work with. So now the problem is it needs to connect back onto the main mesh, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and essentially add edge loops in here and just re-bridge it across. So what I can do is just go like, I'm going to add a bridge here, bridge there, and delete these. Or not bridge, I just edge loop, right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and just make sure it has the same number. So I was deleting these ones. Let's see, it goes there, there, because that's obviously the same number to reconnect. And up here, I think I need one more right there. So what I can do is I can just select this to here, bridge cross, and then same thing on the other side, this to here, this to here. So don't worry if you're like, this is so many different things that you have to do. It's really, I'm just showing you a lot of different editing techniques that I've had to do. And so I don't use all of them all the time. And so I just leave those bounding edge loops right there. And so, you can see bridge across just fine. So you don't have to do all those, everything I'm doing here. I'm just showing you a variety of techniques, and whatever works for you works for you. So let's say I also did these ones right here, and I like them. Now I need to kind of fix the other one. So come over here. So we have this other shell right here, and we need to do the same thing. But instead of me having to do that whole process again, what I want to do is, or what I can do is, I'm going to just steal what I just did here on the neighbor and apply it to the other one. So in order to do that, I'm going to duplicate this guy, and then I'm going to select everything but these middle faces. So go ahead and select these guys and delete those ones. So now I'm all left with is this guy right here. And again, if I go to lighting, two-sided lighting, right? This is the back and this is the front. So I'm going to combine this with this other piece right here. So I'm going to go mesh combine. We're going to isolate this one. So you can see this is the outside, but again, because those normals are backwards, we're going to select these faces here and reverse the normals by going mesh display reverse. And then what I could do is I can just weld points. If they're not actually aligning, you could, what I could do is I can do the same thing I did earlier, where I'd like select that right there, delete that, and then, re-bridge from here to here, all the way across. But since these perfectly align, just the way I've been working with it, I could just select this and go to edit mesh. Let's see, I think it's merge, and just have that merge threshold. If I press 3 on my keyboard, I see these bend nicely. Where those touch, then that means they merged successfully, right? And then I can delete my history again. So I just essentially copied what I did on this one onto this one. And again, I would come in here and I would just make sure these guys do not overlap where they touch the scalp. And of course, this is penetrating the scalp a lot. That's just because I need more resolution here, but I want to save time and not do this forever. Okay, so if your mesh is like, curving so much like mine is, like you see how there's like so much of a curvature at the root, like it's like having to bend around the scalp, like it's having to bend around and maneuver around the scalp before it falls down. Once you get to a certain subdivision level, you don't have to worry about that too much because you got enough of these smaller shapes that you can start cutting them up in a much simpler way. And I'll show you guys how to do that. Where you're just going to cut those edges, bridge across, and then make minor tweaks. And you don't have to spend a lot of time in the in-between faces, like fixing them. And of course, like I said, if you had like, let's say we had like Pippi Longstocking, like I think Pippi Longstocking has like those, pigtails popping off. This would be way easier to deal with. So I'm just going to kind of run through these really quickly though. So I have this subdivision, right, which is what we were just working on, right? We're just essentially, and you can see here I actually had a different method where I was actually drawing curves on that face and then generating them because that just gave me better curvature control. There's like 100 different ways you can do this. That's whatever works for you. And from there, I have 4 different ones, and then I went ahead and just subdivided again. So now I have 8 ones and different ones. And you can see I'm actually going and like I've just been cutting them like this way, cut, and now I'm going in the opposite way, right? I'm cutting across this way, perpendicular to where I was going before. And you can see it's not really like they're not quite lining up, which is kind of makes it a little harder, right? You can see like this one up here is higher than this one right here. If you can get that to be more grid-like, it's a lot simpler, right? Let's not look at the curved one right there. And you can also see that it's not actually just perfectly bridged across. Like if I just bridged from, let's take a look at this one, right? If I just bridged from here to here, right, just straight, this area down here might not match the, essentially the proportion of that area right there, right? So let's take a look at these two again, right? So let's take a look at the surface area that this has touching the scalp, right? So I'm essentially determining that this surface area right here, of this right here, versus this surface area on this tube right here is equal. So I'd come down here, and because of this long curved shape, I might have to actually change, essentially, like if I combine these two together on the roots, or at the tips, then I have to make sure that this surface area right here matches this surface right here. So I spent some time after doing some density tests of just testing this and seeing like, is this area over here the same surface area as this area over here so that they're proportional to the roots. And so the only way to do that and test that is of course to just, select these tubes and going in and doing a tube groom test. And you can see I actually smoothed one side versus the other side. We can just do the smooth side. So we'll just go ahead and tube groom, select these, test them, check that that's all good, and click generate. It's all good. Let me pause. Okay, I generated those guides. I'll go ahead and hide the tubes right there. And we're just going to go ahead and generate the hair. And so I would come in here and I would just, and we can hide those guides, just look at that hair and see if that density feels pretty accurate. And because mine has so much curvature, right, those center guides are driving a lot of that center volume. See, again, you have to be careful, like I was talking about before when we were looking at the single big shell, of determining if that density is correct or not, because those center guides can really throw things off because they're pulling your center hair into the center of your mesh. If you have too large of these shells, so just be aware of that. But you can see this looks pretty decent, and I think that's looking pretty accurate. And then I would move on to the next step. But if it's looking like significantly wrong, then I would come back into my shells, right? Delete my guides, of course. So delete the guides, hide the hair. You can delete these guys, you don't need them anymore. And then I would come back to my shell and just tweak it, right? So we keep going and keep going and keep going. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys a few last elements here, and then we'll wrap it up. So as I'm going along, right, I'm just going to show you each subdivision level. I'm just dividing it into more and more. You can see I'm like colorizing things so I can get a better view of how many shells I have and where I'm going to cut things up. So you can see I'm actually starting to like think of how I'm going to cut it up by coloring it. You guys don't have to do that. I quickly abandoned that and didn't do that. And you can see I'm also isolating into different quarters, right? So I actually started grouping these into different little quarters so that I could more easily group and understand these. And especially when I was talking to people for feedback, I can kind of break these into like, hey, does this quarter work well, or does this little area work well versus the other one? So organizing these really helped kind of solidify my head. And around this point where you get to kind of like this density, it gets a little bit easier to make new tubes, right? So looking at these guys right here, I'll go ahead and isolate them, and I'll show you really quickly how it's working, right? So because these are getting kind of smaller and the density is getting higher, it's going to be a lot easier to go ahead and cut this, bridge across between them, and not have to play with the shape too much, right? Again, if you have a high curvature area, like you see how much it curves from the scalp, you're still gonna have to clean it up, but you're gonna spend a lot less time than you do at the very beginning. And so I have some tools, I'll post them and I'll share them, but I started creating tools to help with my workflow, right? Because it took until this point here where I was just doing it manually before I decided, hey, this is taking too much time having to iterate on this. I need some tools to make it go better, faster. So I created a shelf. So you can do that by going in here and just doing a new shelf. And I dragged all the tools I was using. And I can walk through them. And actually some of them, because they're just showing the description, but not actually what they are. Actually, it's been a while since I don't actually remember which ones they are. But there's ones like, for instance, this one that selects the first CV curve, the CV of my curve, which was I was using so I can manually adjust and rotate my curves. Here's the lofting, here's the EP curve tool, here's the rebuild tool. And this one might be, I think either, oh, this is converting polygon edges to curves. So if I wanted to, create a curve from this polygon edge because I like the shape and I'm using lofting, right? I could just select that and I create a curve, which is found under modify, converts polygon edges to curves, right? And then I have like a little divider here. And so to add these, you could just find them in the toolbars, and then you can just hold Control Shift and click on it, and you can see it adds it there. If you need to remove it, you can click there. So here's my reversing my normals, here's bridging, here's quad drawing, here's target welding, here's merging, here's using the multi-cut tool, insert edge loop tool, edge slide tool. These are all underneath these three slides here. Combine, separate, detach, extract. This is adding more subdivision levels. You don't need all these. These are just things as I was working, I was like, oh, I really like using this tool. You won't have to use this for a long time. This is a sweep mesh. So I was using this to create like a twisted curve shape on some of my meshes, but we're not gonna worry about that. Selecting my history or deleting my history is really helpful. I do that a lot. And here's where I start adding some of my other specific things, right? So here I have some sculpting tools. I'll skip that. And here's some other ones I added later. Like I have shrink wrapping and mirroring, and I guess this one's just twisting. We're not going to worry about this one right now, but I actually have a couple mel scripts that I wrote just to make things a little bit easier on myself. So I highly recommend, if you guys haven't yet, I'm not going to get into it right now in terms of how to write. Maybe I'll show you guys one of them, but I'm not going to get into all the specifics. But I highly recommend that you guys get used to writing your own mail scripts. You don't have to be a programmer to do it. You just have to look up examples and open up your script editor and see what commands Maya's running. So with Mel, you can look at the different, like let's say, for instance, what I'm doing here is, we'll isolate just this one. And let me go ahead and just prepare this mesh the way I would probably want to prepare it. I'm just going to add a middle subdivision there. All right, so let's say I'm selecting these edge loops right here. You see I have a select command, right? And I wouldn't use this one right here specifically, but essentially what it's doing is it's just going ahead and running the command that's Maya's using to do whatever I'm doing in my the 3D viewport, or these user-friendly actions I'm doing, and they're running scripts and code, and Maya spits that back out to you so you can actually use it or diagnose it, right? And so then I'd run a detach, right? So I'll just go ahead and detach components, and that should give me, it should have given me the command for it, but if it's not, we might have to go edit mesh detach. And you can see it, I want to undo it, shows it, but it's not doing the selecting. And if it's not showing you, what you can do is, let's do Control Y. You come over here and go to history, or I think it's history, echo all commands. So be careful, because this can actually like slow your computer down, because it's going to literally repeat everything to you. So there's like a repeating warning. It's going to keep repeating, and it can kind of lock things up or slow things down. But now if I go in here and I just detach it, so detach component, you can see you might have to scroll up a little bit. It went ahead, and so you can see it's updating all these material things, which is a little annoying. But if I scroll up, I can eventually find the command detach component. So what you can do is you can literally copy paste it down here, right? Let's go ahead. I'm going to delete these guys. That's a different thing. And I'm going to go ahead and come back here. Let's turn off that echo all commands. So it's going to take too long. Wait for it to update. Okay. And I'm just going to Control Z that before I detached it. So I come in here, instead of running that detached components, I can actually come in here and click on this button right here, which is execute without, if you click on this execute, it's going to clear this out. If I click on this, it's going to execute without clearing my script. I'll click on that, and then it actually ran the detach command. So it actually did the same thing as if I right-clicked and said detach components, or found it up there. So that's, what's great about this is you can do the things you want to do inside of the viewport. You can grab the commands, paste them in here, and with a little editing and logic that you script in, you can automate things, right? So you do it once, you write up a little script of those commands, and then you can automate it, which makes it a lot faster. So what I did is I went through that command, or that process of selecting those edge loops, and then I'm detaching the component, and then I'm separating the object, right? So separate the object. Then I delete history on the object. Then I select one of the objects, and I select the edge loop from here to here, and I select the edge loop from here to here, and then I bridge them. And then, missed an edge. Bridged them. And I added a division there. And then I went ahead and selected the object, and I deleted the history, right? And then I did the same thing on the other one, right? And so I did that manually, and then I figured out by copying those commands and then doing a little extra scripting, how to turn that into an automated script where I can just run a for loop, and it's going to go ahead and cut it up and do it all for me. So I'll show you the result of that, and I'll share that script with you guys. So what I did in order to get that to work is just go back, and so what you do is you select your tube that you want to cut up, and you select the edges on the opposite sides that you want to kind of split it along and bridge it. And then I have this one right here, which is called cut and bridge, and you can see I wrote selects two edge loops to separate the shell, then run auto cuts and bridges two separate objects. And it doesn't work if you have bad history on this. So I'm just going to delete history, which I really should just fix that so that you don't have to do that. So just deletes history before you do it. And so I select those edge loops, and then I run cut and bridge. And you can see here, it actually created two separate tubes and just did all that bridging and separating for me. And so now it's really easy for me to just select pretty much any one of these tubes, select an edge on one side. Let's see, let's isolate one of these guys. Select the edge on one side, select the edge on the other side, and then run cut and bridge. And again, I have to make sure that I have no history on that. So I might select all these guys and just delete history. So come here, select the edge on one side, select the edge on the other side, cut bridge. Now I have more of them. Select the edge loop on this side, select the edge loop on this side, run cut and bridge. And now I'm just keep it, subdividing it and stuff like that. Again, I'd have to come up here to the scalp and make sure I'm actually like editing them. If I wanted to go even more advanced, I could do like some kind of auto projection for me and fix that for me. And maybe even select the vertices that are near each other at the root and push them away from each other so we have spacing, but that would get pretty complicated. So if I go in here and go ahead and edit, we can see that command. And so this is that whole command here, right? So, and I'll talk through it a little bit. So we have this right here. And so this is gonna, so even a lot of this stuff I don't actually know really what it means, but I just know the syntax that I have to follow because as an artist I'm not trying to bog myself down. I just want to speed up my workflow. So I'm not going in and I'm having to read the documentation or the like some kind of instructional book on how to write in Mel, which you can if you have the time, and it's a great idea. But I'm just trying to get faster, right? I just want to get the job done. So yeah, I just know that I'm essentially defining a function here, right? And then this is going to be the whole function itself. And then I'm going to call the function. So when I run the script, what it's going to do is defines the function and then it executes it. So here you can see with my edge loops selected, I go ahead and run detach components. And then what it's going to do, it's going to select those most recently cut edges. So, and then it's going to go ahead and save that as a selection. So it just saves it. And I'm also going to go ahead and separate polygon, which is going to split my object into two objects if they're disconnected. And so I went ahead and I stored those objects that I cut. And then I'm going to go through each one of those objects. And so in those objects, I'm going to select the object. I'm going to go to edge mode. And when I go to edge mode, this is just a trick I found out through doing this, is that if I go to edge mode after I cut it and split it, so let's go ahead and I'll do it here. So select that, select that. I'm going to go ahead and run detach and then go to object mode, and then I'm going to go ahead and separate. If I selected an object and I went to edge mode, you can see just by default, this is just like a handy little thing loophole I found, is because I recently cut it. If I go into object mode selecting that object, it's going to select those last selected edges, which is really convenient, right? Because selecting those edges would have been a real pain in the butt trying to do that through code manually. So, or I'd have to manually do it. So go to edge mode and it automatically selects those edges for me. And then I bridge across them and I just, when I ran the actual tool, the settings I like, it spit back all the different setting values here. So these are essentially, if you go into here and go to, let's open up bridge and tool settings, and you set these like how many divisions, smoothing angle, if there's any twist, all that stuff. These are what these flags are. So I just copy paste whatever I liked from that when I did it manually. And then I go back to object mode, and then I deselect the object, and then select the object itself, and I delete its history. And then because it's a for loop, I go to the other object and do the exact same thing, right? So some of the stuff, you're not going to be able to know just from coming up here and copy pasting, right? You're going to have to kind of understand how you would, a little bit of the syntax. And so there's so many examples online. Just Google like what you want to do using Mel in Maya. And after a little digging, there's almost always an example or some script someone posted on there. Copy paste it, bring it into your script, cut it up, use those pieces, try to apply to your script. Sometimes it doesn't work because you just don't know exactly what it's doing, but you can look up the commands, you can look up a guide on this kind of stuff online. There's stuff out there. And so this is my smaller and easier one. So I have that. I also have a auto locking the vertices. So what I was doing earlier, right, where I was trying to move those, let's see here. I wanted to move these vertices here without affecting like the root vertices, right? So let's say I'm selecting these vertices over here. So let's say I went ahead and selected, let's go ahead and select this way. Let's do this one. Let's say I want to select these vertices and move them around without affecting any of these guys, right? Just go ahead and select those, go to convert to vertices, and let's maybe get rid of these ones. These, don't worry about what I'm doing specifically right now, or those selection techniques if I was going too fast. So I'm going to lock these vertices. So instead of having to go through that where I go to the channel box, I select these, go through, lock them, because when I'm done with that, I have to go back and unlock them again, which is a huge pain in the butt. I'd select the vertices I want to lock, and I have this lock command that I ran. So with those vertices selected, I essentially went through and ran a loop, and for each of those vertices, I just select locked the transforms of the X, Y, and Z, right? And that's just that command right there. And so I'll just go ahead and click on lock vertices. So those vertices are now locked. I can't move them, but I can move these ones. And then instead of having to select those same vertices and unlock them, I just have this unlock, right? Which just selects all of my vertices and sets their lock values to false. So it's just unlocking literally all the vertices in my object. So now they're unlocked. So that makes it really easy and fast for me. I also have this one right here, which is essentially going to, for sculpting. So instead of having to lock the root vertices by selecting them and manually locking them, I'm actually freezing them so I can use sculpting tools. So when I select this, what it's going to do is it's based on the UVs, right? So it looks at these vertices, and if the UVs are above the midpoint on the UV editor, so we come here, all right? If they're up here and above the midpoint, then what I do is I lock them or freeze them. So when I run this one, so I'll go ahead and freeze it. You can see it's already frozen. This is the UI for freezing, or the visual indicator that those vertices are frozen, and I just have it switch to the grab tool for me. So then now I can go ahead and sculpt this without moving my vertices away from the tip, right? Or from the root, so or the scalp, sorry. And so that just makes it really easy for me to not have to go back and push all those vertices back onto the mesh again. And so then I can go through and I can run any of those sculpting tools. And then I can just go back to that sculpting and then just unfreeze all. So if I go here, tool settings, and unfreeze all, then I can, not that I would want to actually unfreeze those roots, but you know, if you need to, that you could do that. So let's take a look at these other ones. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. So I have smooth tubes. So because, you know, if I'm working with these, let's hide these guys. Let's go to this one, right? I have a bunch of tubes now, right? And I want to kind of preview this with as like really high frequency guides, right? Because if I ran this one right here, I'd get one guide here, one guide here. There's a lot of spacing, and I'm not going to have quite the accuracy I would want in the final image. And what I did was I just wrote a script for myself where I went to, actually, let's do it with like a higher subdivision level. So you can see now I have a lot of them, and I'll just press 1. So you can see there's a ton of them now that I created. But if we go through that whole process, like step by step, at this point, you know, I feel pretty confident about the density of these, right? So I'm not going to have to worry too much about, and you can see I'm in the middle of cutting up even these ones out here even more. You can see right here, I'm actually getting pretty small, right, on those tubes, right? But anyways, so what I like to do is I like to smooth these tubes just so I have more resolution. So what I do is let's go ahead and select the group that has them in there. And then I just have this one right here. Again, this one's pretty simple. With my selection, what I do is I duplicate these tubes. I put them in a group. I pull them out. I run smooth on them. I delete the history, and then I select them, and then I hide them. So I go ahead and run that there. It's just, again, things that I had to do, like tedious things where I was just like, oh, I hate doing this every single time. So I don't have to do it again, right? So I select that, click on smooth, and it does a lot of stuff really quickly, and you might not notice it, but you can see it took that group, duplicated it, put its own group here, and then hid that group, and essentially smooth those meshes. And in this case, it didn't smooth them, which is a problem. I don't know why I didn't smooth them. Because, yeah, those should not be the exact same. So there's probably something I have to do, and I would have to edit that. But the idea there is it would, you know, select all those tubes and then just run mesh smooth, just so they're like higher resolution. And so we'll just go ahead and show that group, right? So they're like higher resolution. So I'm going to get more guides, and then I would feed that in to the tube grooming. And I was hiding it just so I select all these tubes. Let's delete their history. And then I would go into the tube groom, load them in, test, and I could just hide that group. And so you can see I'm getting like a ton of guides. In my current version, I actually create like 2,500 guides. So you can end up creating a lot of guides, and don't be surprised of having to do that. So actually, I think I might have them here. So let's click on test. There we go. Yep, to 2,700 guides. And then I just click generate. Let's go ahead and delete that region map. And I'm going to do that really quickly. So there we go. We created all those guides. And then we just go ahead and regenerate hair. So we get those colors of those guides. And we have all those little tiny region maps perfectly following the shape of those tubes I've created. And just while we're here, I'll talk about it. A lot of times what I'll do is if it's hard to kind of see, especially when you get to this level, if there's like any, like you can see this one actually has some problems, right? So it should be all one color, but you can see it's actually bleeding across. And same thing with this one right here. Actually, no, those ones are good. These two are separate ones. This one right here has a problem, so I just kind of find the root of it up to here, and I would sometimes what you can do is you can look at it in on the inside. And so if there's like cross boundaries here, I actually don't even know which one it is. Gets a little hard to see sometimes, right? So you can see this is getting a multicolor right here, which in this case I think might be a different issue, but you can see there's like a lot of weird color breaking here. And if you don't see it on this, don't worry. When you do it and you've looked at it long enough on your own, you're going to notice it yourself. So, but looking at it on mine obviously is going to be like kind of abstract. Is, you know, this is a great way of, I would go in and then start pushing those tubes apart again, right? Delete those guides, stop generating the hair, delete that XG Groom folder, and then I would bring back the original one, right? Not those. I can delete these smooth tube groups because editing, that's going to be a pain in the butt. And let's go ahead and do lighting, two-sided lighting. And so if there's a problem area, right, where they're too close together, then I would just go ahead and you can see maybe there's like some overlap between this one and this one somewhere. And so I would have to separate those. Okay, some of the things I'll just quickly talk about them. This one right here this is my cut and bridge. This is select every other edge loop. There's been situations where I wanted to do that. This is converting multiple edge loops to curves. It's essentially the same thing as doing that modify convert, but it's doing multiple. This deletes all the RenderMan volume aggregate things that pop up down here because that gets really annoying. And then I also have these toggling visibility of my display layers. So I just have these bunch of different display layers, so I don't have to like select things and run hide and unhide. I can actually come in here and just toggle visibility on them, which is really helpful when you have selections that you're trying to be careful of, right? Like I have a bunch of selections. I want to hide something so I can look at this more carefully. Like I want to hide the character. So instead of unselecting this, I can just click on this so I'm not like ruining my workflow. So I do the same thing with, you know, the scalps, right? So visibility of the scalps. And then these are also templating. Here we have lock root vertices and et cetera, et cetera. So this has gone on long enough. I will upload and share those scripts. If you get a script, what you do is you just go in here to the script editor, find that script through the load option and load it into ML, and then you can save it to your shelf. So you go here, and then you can just open that script, go ahead and find it. So go ahead and click open, and then you can go ahead and save it to your shelf. So save script to shelf, and it'll show up here, and then when you do that, you can go and edit the appearance of it. Generally speaking, you just set the name if you want to, which is in this case set edge, or the icon label set edge. And you can have a bunch of them like these ones where they look exactly the same, just have different names. And then you can just go to your shelves and you can save all shelves. And then when you open Maya again, that shelf is already set up. It has all the tools you want. And then you know, from there, it's a lot easier to just, instead of having to hunt for things, just really quickly go.